Hey friends, it's Laurie. Thanks for stopping by. Today I'm crafting a Hello Fall sign, a pumpkin on a pedestal, and 3 fabric flowers. They're all easy to make. I used mostly Dollar Tree supplies. I hope you enjoy them, so let's get busy. Getting started, I'm using one of the 12-inch willow wreaths from the Dollar Tree. I'm painting mine with some orange acrylic paint, but you can always use spray paint. That will work great too. I wasn't super fussy when I was painting it because I am going to de-stress it later. When the top was complete, I then turned it over and I made sure to get the sides and the back. Now that it's dry, I'm going to be adding on a center. And I'm recycling a round piece of cardboard from a frozen pizza. But you can pretty much use any cardboard that you have on hand. I placed it under the wreath and it's just a little bit too big, so I'm trimming off the edges. To cover the cardboard circle, I'm using a piece of orange fabric, and I picked this up at the Dollar Tree. Because of my lighting, it looks like a completely different color, but it actually matches my wreath perfectly. I placed my cardboard circle down and cut around it, giving myself about a 2-inch edge. I then used my scissors to make some small slices in the fabric, which will make it easier to attach. I used my glue gun, added on some glue, and attached the fabric to the cardboard. With my circle complete, I'm adding some hot glue to the back of my wreath and then attaching the two together. I wanted to share with you today that I am participating in my monthly friend collab group, and it's being hosted by my sweet friend Liana from Liana DIY. Our guests this month are Sandra from DIYs at the Schwoven's Nest and Ellie from DIY From House to Home. Be sure to check them out along with my other crafty friends. I will have the playlist linked below in my description. If you're new to my channel, please consider clicking on that little red subscribe button below and leaving me a thumbs up. And to all my returning friends, you know I'm always so happy to see you. I'm using a piece of sandpaper and I'm gently distressing the front of my wreath. I'm giving mine just a touch of a rustic vibe, and this step is completely optional. I'm using 2 of the small cream burlap pumpkins along with 1 green, and these came from the Dollar Tree. They each come with a clip on the back, and I just simply pop them off. I found the placement of my pumpkins on the wreath and then hot glued them into place. I'm adding on some green leaves that I had on hand, along with some of the fall leaves from the Dollar Tree. I first added on my 5 green leaves, and once I had all of those in place, I then added on the leaves from the Dollar Tree. I'm using 3 yellow, 2 green, and 3 orange. And I hot glued them on the bottom edge of the wreath. As I was adding them, I did slightly overlap them, and you could pretty much use any fall colored leaves for this project. I'm adding a sign from this Dollar Tree pack of Harvest Words. You get 6 different phrases in a pack, and I'm using Hello Fall for my project. Even though the color of my khaki paint is super close to the natural color, I'm still giving it a coat. With my paint dry, I'm now accenting my sign with a green colored pencil. I'm outlining all the letters and then rubbing it in with my finger. It won't be a dramatic change, it's just enough to give it a hint of green. Now that I'm done, I'm going to attach it onto my wreath, and I don't want to use hot glue because I'm afraid some of it might sneak out under the letters. So instead, I'm going to use some of this liquid adhesive that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I added some on the back of my Hello Fall sign and then centered it on my wreath. For the pumpkin stem, I'm using a piece of driftwood that I had on hand. You can always go outside and pick up a stick or cut one out of a piece of cardboard. I added some E6000 onto the bottom and attached it behind my pumpkin. I'm making a bow for my wreath and I'm using some fabric that I had on hand. I cut about a 36-inch piece of fabric and then tied it into a bow. I trimmed up the tails and then cut each of them into 3 strips. I attached it to my wreath using some hot glue on the top. Using some raffia that I had on hand, I made a similar size bow. I then used my glue gun and attached it on top of the gingham bow. When I was done, I trimmed up the raffia to match the tails on the wreath. For the hanger, I'm using a piece of Dollar Tree nautical rope. I cut it short enough so that it would hang behind the pumpkin stem, and then I just hot glued it in place. To clean up the back and make it a little prettier, I cut a circle out of a paper bag. I added on some hot glue and attached it to the back. And with that, my Hello Fall pumpkin wreath is ready to hang. Getting started, I'm using 2 of the porcelain harvest stands from the Dollar Tree. I'm using my E6000, adding some to the bottom of one of the stands and then attaching the other on top of it. I then let it set up overnight. Now that they're permanently attached together, I happen to have the same color green acrylic paint. I'm painting the seam because this is one option to hide it, but I prefer the second option, which is wrapping it with a piece of jute. I'm using a piece that I already had on hand. You can pick some up at the Dollar Tree. And using my E6000, I'm just wrapping it around the center. You could also use a piece of the nautical rope from the Dollar Tree, but it seemed a little wide to me for this pedestal. I gave it a couple of hours to set up, and now I'm making a throne for my pumpkin, and I'm using some of the Sahara block from the Dollar Tree. And because I have a piece left over from another project, I'm actually going to recycle this one. To get my measurements, I first placed it on the top of the pedestal and then cut it to fit. I'm adding some E6000 to the top and attaching the block. And once again, I gave it a couple of hours to set up. I'm covering the Sahara block, and I'm using some of this reindeer moss from the Dollar Tree. I added on some hot glue and then covered the sides of the block. While doing this, it's really easy to get burned, so I made sure to use my finger protector. For my first layer, I'm adding in some of these fall foliage leaves from the Dollar Tree, and I cut them from the main stem. To attach them, I randomly added them around the outside of the foam block. 3 of the stems did come with berries, and I made sure to place those 3 in the front. I want to add in different colors of greenery, so I'm using the 7 leaves from this Dollar Tree pumpkin stem. I'm randomly adding them on, and they don't have much of a stem, so if you notice that they're not staying in place, just follow up with a little hot glue. I'm adding on another layer, and I'm using some of the Dollar Tree's eucalyptus. And I'm just pulling the leaves from the main stem. I'm using the 2 longer pieces, adding one on the lower bottom and then one directly across on the top. I'm covering the top edge with some of the leaves and adding the others randomly around the block. And because these don't have much of a stem, I'm hot gluing them into place. I ended up using all but 3 of the double leaves from the eucalyptus. I wanted to add in some flowers and give it just a little pop of color. So I'm using some off of this bunch of flowers that I found at Michael's. They were summer clearance, and I ended up paying a little less than $2. I cut off just enough flowers to give it a little pop of color and added them randomly here and there between the leaves. If you find that the stems aren't long enough to stick into the foam, just attach them with some hot glue. As the crown jewel on the top of my pedestal, I'm adding one of the soft white pumpkins from the Dollar Tree. This step is completely optional. I always like to highlight the lines on my pumpkins, so I'm using a brown colored pencil and I'm just outlining each one. Attaching it is super easy. I place some hot glue on the top of the pedestal and then center down the pumpkin. To finish up, I'm adding a small bow onto my pumpkin pedestal. And I'm using some of the Dollar Tree burlap ribbon. Attaching it together, I'm also using a piece of floral wire. I gave myself about a 6-inch tail and made a 3-inch loop. I then pinched it between my fingers. I then twisted my ribbon and made another 3-inch loop. Once again, pinching this ribbon between my fingers. I then twisted my ribbon again and made one more 3-inch loop. I then transferred it to my left hand because I'm a righty, making sure to keep the ribbon pinched together tightly. I then wrapped my floral wire around the pinched area, pulled it together tightly, and twisted it. I then trimmed off my second tail at an angle. I fluffed out the loops and then wrapped the wire around itself to make a little stem. To finish up, I placed the wired stem into the foam on the side of the pedestal. Now that I'm done, it makes such a pretty and easy to make piece of fall decor. Getting started, I'm using this black and white polka dot fabric from the Dollar Tree. I'm cutting my fabric into 12 by 1 inch strips, and I'm using all of it with the exception of about a 6 by 6 rectangle. And I'm not being super fussy as I'm cutting it. I'm also using some white cotton fabric that I had on hand. You can find this at the Dollar Tree as well. And I'm cutting 12-inch strips, about 50 or so. I want the fabric to look a bit more primitive, so I'm going to dye them with some coffee and cinnamon. I'm using a used coffee pod and I'm adding it to 2 cups of hot water. I'm then adding in a heaping teaspoon of cinnamon. I blended the two together, and if you don't want to use coffee grounds, you can always use instant coffee. I then added in my strips of the polka dot fabric and made sure they were completely covered. I let them soak for about an hour, removed them, and placed in the white strips. After about an hour, I squeeze out as much of the liquid as I can from the strips. I then place them down on a foil-lined baking sheet. I place them in a 225-degree oven for about 15 minutes. When they're dry, I then remove them from the pan and kind of rub them around in my hands to remove most of the coffee grounds. I then stained my rectangle piece of the polka dot fabric. I'm making 3 flowers and I'm using 3 of the wide mouth rings or bands and lids. I'm using some wooden dowels from the Dollar Tree as my stems, and I punched 1 hole in the side of each of the 3 rings large enough to accommodate it. They sold these long dowels in a 12-pack at the Dollar Tree to use for toasting marshmallows. For my flower stems, I'm cutting one at 12, one at 15, and one at 20 inches. Making the flowers is super easy. I'm using my polka dot and white stained fabric strips. I'm folding one piece of fabric in half and sliding it under the bottom of the ring. I open the fabric loop and then push the 2 tails through. I then pull them tightly to hold them in place. I'm now using the white stained fabric and I'm just following the same instructions. Folding it in half, placing it under the ring, finding my loop, and then pulling my 2 tails through. From there, I just followed the same instructions, working my way around the ring and alternating the fabrics. I cut my strips at 12 inches, but you can always cut yours at 10 or even 11. For the smaller rings or bands, you probably want to cut them at 8 to 9 inches, but because I'm going to clean mine up and trim them when I'm done, I like to give myself a little bit extra fabric. I'm making sure to pull the tails tightly so that they fit snugly around the ring. As I'm adding them, I'm making an effort to have my ends match up, but if they're not perfect, not to worry. As I'm adding the fabric strips, I am mindful of where the hole is for the stem. I take a marker and I make a dot on that piece of fabric. The fabric will move around a little bit as you're adding on the strips, but it does give you a general idea of where the opening is. I'm using 38 strips for my wide bands, but depending on how wide or how thin you cut them, you may need a little more or a few less. With my flower complete, I'm going to clean up the ends a bit where they didn't match up perfectly, and then I'm using my scissors to cut them all at an angle. I like to cut mine and just give them a little bit of personality. I worked my way around and now all of the fabric petals are trimmed and angled. For my flower's center, I'm starting with a piece of gingham fabric that I had on hand. I'm also using one of the Dollar Tree pin cushions. It comes with a small white button and an elastic band, and I just removed both. I'll be wrapping the pin cushion in the fabric, so I made sure I had enough and cut away the extra. I placed down the pin cushion and then cut some tiny slices in the fabric. This will make it just a bit easier to wrap around the cushion. I made sure it was flat side up and added some hot glue to the top. I then pressed the fabric tightly around it. With my 3 pieces complete, I'm first going to add in the flower stem. I pushed it through the hole until it touched the inside fabric. To be sure that it doesn't move, I'm hot gluing both ends into place. To add the center of my flower, I'm running some hot glue around the inside edge. I then placed the top in the center and pressed it in place. To finish off the back, I'm using a scrap piece of fabric that matches the pin cushion front, cutting it to size, and then I place some small slices around the circle. I then added some hot glue and attached the fabric. I placed some hot glue around the back of my flower and placed down the covered lid. To finish up, I made 2 additional flowers following the same instructions. I used leftover fabric that I had on hand and incorporated the stained pieces of the polka dot and white fabric. I used the larger leftover piece of polka dot fabric, covered another one of the pin cushions, and added that to another flower. I placed all 3 in a Dollar Tree planter filled with styrofoam, and not only are they super cute, but they smell great too. Here we are at the end of the video, and I really hope you had fun making these fall DIYs with me. Be sure to check out the playlist, and if you're new to my channel and you're thinking, hey, I'd like to come back and hang out with her again, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below. If you're looking for more fall decor ideas after checking out the playlist, come on back and I'll leave some at the end of this video as well as below in my description. I hope you all have an amazing day and I will see you soon. Bye everybody!